Hello, everyone. Thank you all very much for coming. Right, look, this is the fragile foundations of China's rise. Whether that's a good or bad title is for you to decide if you've been following the news. And there's spies and espionage and goodness knows what. And if you follow the Chinese embassy story, it's actually quite interesting that there's this kind of worry about sensitive data since the embassy's been built over, cabling that takes information of secrecy from the government. And so there's a concern that actually China will have access to it. And then you read a story which says that actually China bought a data hub company that actually processes Whitehall confidential information. So they don't need to hide in the basement to spy on Britain. They can just do it in broad daylight on the streets. So anyway, it'll be churlish not to mention that story, but really this is going to be an explainer. Yeah, don't use them. Sorry. This is going to be an explainer about China. Yes. So anything you want to know, these are the experts to ask. So we're going to have a bit of a conversation in some respects on a couple of issues. I kind of rounded them off in terms of economics and political authority type questions. And there may be one or two questions about development and even technology. We'll see how we get on. But I really want to throw it open to you as soon as possible. So let me introduce the panel to you, not in order in which we'll speak because we're going to have a chat. But first up next to me is Kerry Brown, director of the Lao China Institute at King's College, where he's professor of Chinese studies. And Kerry writes about one book a week. And his latest book is The Great Reversal, Britain, China, and the 400-Year Contest for Power. Then we have, in the middle there, we have Hugo de Burgh, director of the China-UK Creative Industries, formerly the China Media Centre at Westminster University. He's the author of Who Are We and How Will We Survive in the Age of Asia, which is available on the bookstore. He's actually, that book was actually launched by Vince Cable. Who knew that Vince could get around so quickly? But he's the founder also of the Kensington Wade School, a network of schools teaching bilingual English and Chinese, and he's also the author of China's Media in the Emerging World Order. And finally, at the end of the table, we have Linda Yueh, CBE, Fellow in Economics at St Edmund Hall in Oxford University, Adjunct Professor of Economics at the London Business School, Associate Professor at Chatham House, and a member of the UK Soft Power Council. If that's not enough, you'll also recognise her from her time as the BBC's chief business correspondent. She's the author of The Great Crashes, Lessons from Global Crashes and How to Prevent Them, selected as the best new economics books by the Financial Times. And guess who wrote the testimonial? Vince Cable. So there you go. Let's just start on the economics of the thing. World Bank describes China as a middle-income country. China itself calls itself a developing country. And it's had this kind of, we look at China maybe for the last 20-odd years having this 10%, 9% growth flourish. I was just wondering what you see as the state of play today, because if you've read Dan Wang's book, Breakneck, I read one review of it, which was saying that if you had that breakneck analysis 15 years ago, it would have been appropriate. Now it seems to slow down a bit and things are not looking as good as they did, especially post-COVID. So, Linda, do you want to give us, since you're the economics voice on the panel, do you want to give us a sense about the mood in China and how the economy is faring?
I think the challenge that China faces is that it's very difficult to overcome the middle-income country trap. So most countries get to about middle-income level, which China roughly is, but it's unlikely to, it's unlikely to continue to, I was going to say it's very hard to grow to join the ranks of rich countries. In fact, only about a quarter of the world's economies are high income. And the World Bank says that in 1960, there were 101 middle-income countries. By 2008, only 13 of them had joined the ranks of rich countries. So this challenge for China is also the reason why, if you look at the growth rate slowing down, once you reach a certain income level, it becomes a lot harder to grow. So, for instance, advanced economies have an average growth rate. Well, we'll just take this country. It used to be 2.5%. It's now about 1%. But if you thought back to the previous period of the 1990s, there was stronger growth. Emerging markets typically grow faster because they're at a lower level of income. So think of it this way. And I can't believe I'm about to use hand gestures to make an economics chart out of thin air. But basically, if you're an advanced economy, you're at the technology frontier, pretty close to it. In order to grow more quickly, you have to push up the frontier. Developing countries are farther from the frontier. They just have a lot more room to catch up. So essentially, it's hard to tell at the moment whether China's slowing growth, because it has slowed a lot, is a function of cyclical factors or structural. What I just described is structural. As you hit a certain income level, you start to grow more slowly. But China's also growing more slowly because it's had a huge property bust. So the last chapter of my book, The Great Crashes, which I didn't bring a copy, I should learn from Hugo so I can lift it up. The next great crash I write about is China. And so after a property crash, it's very challenging to grow quickly, as we know. So in theory, that's cyclical. But in other words, when they come out from the other side of it, which, by the way, it took us a long time. It took the U.S. a bit quicker. Japan took decades. So when I say they come out on the other side of it, the cyclical could feel structural for quite a long time. So I think it's those two factors, which means that at the moment, China is finding it hard to grow. And I think until they can sort the property market, it's going to be very challenging for the whole economy to grow. There's not suggestions that, of course, some bits of it grow, but really we're talking about the overall economy. So, for instance, the biggest asset held by households in China is property. So if the property value has collapsed and the whole sector is still being sorted out, but not yet sorted out, then it's called a negative wealth effect. People feel less well off because their biggest asset is worth a lot less, and therefore that's going to dampen consumption. And that's also one of the reasons why China is trying to stimulate growth through encouraging people to buy property or to invest. Thank you. But those are sort of measures you take, but fundamentally, they have to sort out the property market before I think they can grow back at whatever their structural rate is, which is, I said, at the moment, is very hard to tell. So
when you talk about property crash, I mean, it's that Evergrande as the property developer. It was a $350 billion crash, wasn't it? It's not like a minor blip. And that has significant repercussions across the economy, as you say, because a lot of people have invested their time and money in buying property, even off spec, off plan. So that it has massive implications for the way the economy is now going to try to recover. Following that, or in the course of that, COVID was a hit, which also took its impact on industry and all the rest of it. Anyway, look, forget me. Anybody else want to comment on this about how the economy's faring?
Well, I suppose from a sort of micro point of view, I was telling a British publisher recently that I had written a novel about Chinese students and how difficult they found life and so forth and the pressures upon them. And he said to me, but Chinese students are also rich. Nobody would feel any sympathy for Chinese students. And I realized that the image that many of our compatriots have in their minds of China is of an immensely rich, powerful, and aggressive country. And this really doesn't tally with my own experience of China or Chinese people in Britain. Many of the students that I've had over the years, about 20 years I've been teaching Chinese students, some come from rich families, of course they do, rich officials, corrupt probably, but many of them come from families, large families, extended families, where there are perhaps 6 cousins, and it is decided that one can go abroad and carry the burden of representing their family, their large extended family, and come back and get a really good job which will help all the other members of the family. And some of them come from really quite poor areas, small little towns and so on. And when you walk around in China, if you can walk around in China, you'll see too a tremendous contrast between what Tom Friedman describes as the high-tech future of China, which is quite fabulous, of course, and Kerry and Linda can doubtless tell us more about that, but the sheer poverty of the peasants working on the construction sites, or the people in the little satellite towns, or indeed the unemployed students in the suburbs of Beijing or Shanghai. So I just try and give a bit of color to Linda's more academic analysis.
Indeed. Well, I mean, as it happens, a lot of people are not working on construction sites even anymore, are they? Because they don't actually.
I mean, they got robots.
No, I mean that the construction industry is
yeah.
in a massive, massive hit. That's the point. Last time I went there a year ago, and of course I could see cranes building these buildings, and I thought, what's the fuss about? They're still building buildings, of course, but they were on the drawing board 5 years ago, so they're just running them down now. Anyway, Kerry, you got any thoughts on how the economy is faring? What's your views on?
Sorry, I mean, as a university, really, I couldn't add to the excellent interventions of my predecessors, but as a university, obviously, we think a lot about China as a technology player. And I suppose because there's going to be the kind of plenum next week for 3 days, and that's the moment when I think the 15th five-year program is going to be talked about. I suppose the thing that's most interesting, you mentioned Dan Wang's book Breakneck, he talks about different kinds of technology, is sort of China's appearance really as a massive technology player. And the data is really personally on human capital. So I think China produces 80,000 PhD students in STEM subjects every year, graduates. I think America produces 40,000, but 2/3 of those are domestic, and then 1/3 is international. Probably a high proportion of those are originally from China. And no one else comes close to that. In terms of STEM undergraduates, it's even, 3.5 million STEM undergraduate, science, technology, engineering and maths graduates every year. And I think America produces, India is the second at about 2.2 million. These are the people that will make the future, right? And I mean, it's an incredible thing. And then finally, just on the overall kind of budget, I think what China's trying to do is probably what South Korea did in the 90s by addressing some of these systemic issues by an enormous kind of technology splurge. And I think it's got a good chance of pulling it off. It won't be easy, but the scale and the speed that it's doing it is quite incredible. And I mean, just in terms of what China's like now, I mean, I did notice last time I went that robotics is everywhere, right? I mean, I was served coffee by a robot, right, in the Shangri-La in Shenzhen. It made a hell of a mess, and it needed 3 humans to clear up that mess. But it it was fun to work, to look at. And a colleague of mine who works at Fudan University gets a driverless car to work every morning, right? I mean, this seems to be very, very normal. So I think that's a big, big change, even in the last 5 years, and significant. Economically, it's very significant.
No, I always thought, I mean, you can now go down the streets. I used to live in Suzhou, and now you see these postal deliveries by robot roaming down the street and all the rest of it. And you do think it works in China in some respects because there's a little bit of social discipline. If that was in Manchester, you just kick it over, wouldn't you? And steal the package. I mean, it's like, no offense, anybody from Manchester, I didn't mean that wasn't a slur on Manchester. Anywhere you'd nick it. But anyway, but also I was in a hotel with the robot cleaning the floor, stopped me going in the lift because they went in before me and shut the door. So there's all kinds of problems with it. Matter of fact, the last time I went, because you have to now go on WeChat for everything. Yeah, you can't really pay by cash. I mean, you can, but it's very difficult. But you go on this kind of system to get on WeChat, and you go through about 20 pages of taking every bit of information they can from you. Yes. And it came to the last page where you take a photograph, and because I got a beard, he wouldn't recognize me. 25 times I did that entire system, and it tried to suggest I was back in the system. But that's because Chinese people don't have beards. But anyway, so look, the general story here is there's one part on technology and employment and another part on the kind of political and social development. If we just want to play a bit with this conversation about unemployment and technology, because I think we should premise everything by saying a lot of Chinese data and statistics could be questioned. Yes, it's not necessarily fully public, but it does say that there's about 20% of youth unemployment at the moment in China, which compares probably with about 12% in the UK. 8% graduate unemployment compared to about 5% in the UK. So again, what's your thoughts? I mean, as Kerry was saying, people are moving now into these kind of more digitized graphics, exciting subjects. And just again, as one example, last year when I was in Shanghai, I was doing a 2-week summer school with architecture graduates. I teach architecture. And they were finally a master's students, 40 of them. And I basically went in and I said, hands up those people who want to be architects. Nobody. They were just finishing off their architecture degree just to get out, and they go and work in the electronics industry or the graphics industry or the computer industry. But architecture was now a dead letter. Do you know what I mean? So anyway, I am painting a negative picture, but am I painting the correct picture, or do you see that there's a potential for much more dynamic within China at the moment? Because we've been writing about China dying a death, or ceasing to be non-capitalist for an awful long time, a non-democratic country. Is there a possibility for real social transformation, do you think, in China?
Well, just so, the demographics is very serious. So from now, the Chinese population declines unless the latest sort of policies to encourage families to have more kids works, which is unlikely. So there's incentives to sort of try and encourage people to have more children, but it's too early to say whether they're working. But if the kind of trajectory continues, as I understand it, by 2100, China's population will be about 700 million. So I don't see. So the policy response is, I think that technology will solve this, right? I think the Chinese political elite, they're technocrats. I mean, Xi Jinping is, I think, a water engineer. The people around him are mostly kind of from a technocratic background, not all, but mostly. So I think that they do think technology is a huge policy solution for environment and for demographics. And that's why I think they are putting the resources they're putting into it. So the research and development budget in the last year was $460 billion US. I think in Britain it was about 25 billion. America is more, but private corporations take a lot of that. So it's putting significant kind of investment into this. But it's a question of, will that work, right? It's never been. It's always scale and speed with China. So will this particular use and deployment of technology deal with the demographic issue, but also deal with the upskilling of, a kind of significant proportion of the population, particularly young people? Will it kind of avoid unemployment, because of people losing their jobs to technology? All these are unknown. And are we seeing at the moment kind of the first real turbulence, or is this just teething before China moves into what it calls the 2035 kind of, the achievement of this modernity with Chinese characteristics?
Thanks very much. Yeah, that pragmatic approach, even worse in some respects than technocratic approach, is fundamental to the way China works, isn't it? Here.
I think that the failure to deal with the demographic problem, which, as we all know, was created by the Communist Party some years ago, is symptomatic of a much wider problem in Chinese society. Now, it's very strange to talk at the same time, and Kerry's absolutely right. China is at the forefront of many different technologies and is likely to overtake the United States in many technologies over the next few years as well. But on the other side, there is a malaise which I date from about 5 or 6 years ago, the beginning of COVID. And I read it only through the people that I have met, either my students, master students, several hundred of them over the last few years, and also the officials and personnel in media and other institutions of Chinese life that I've been dealing with on professional development courses for some 15 to 20 years now. And whereas 5 or perhaps 6 or 7 years ago, if you asked a young Chinese on a master here, regardless of what subject they were studying, they wanted to go back to China because the future was in China from their point of view. From our point of view, the future may still be in China, but from their point of view, the future was in China then. Now, that is really not the case. And they are either trying to find ways of staying here, or if they can't, they're trying to find opportunities in China which are, if you like, safe. So, for example, one of my students came back to see me recently and introduced her husband and so forth, and she's in the media. And I know that the media has been virtually destroyed in China since COVID, and also because of government regulation. But she was very happy and she had a very good job. And her husband had a very good job too. And I realized why. Because they were in news. This is the only area of media, news and current affairs, which is completely subsidized by the party. So they were okay. Another of my students talked to me not long ago about the boy that who was hoping to marry her. And she said to me, I'm not going to marry him unless he gets a job as a guanyan, as an official. He was doing the examinations to be an official in the civil service. And I was amazed because 5 or 6 years ago, everybody wanted their boyfriend or their girlfriend to xiahai, to go into the oceans and build a business and create a business. So there's a completely different attitude has developed, it seems to me, among Chinese people as to their future. They're scared of marriage, they're scared of private enterprise and so forth, and they'll only go into it if they can't do anything else. It's the state they need protection from.
Looking at China's entrepreneurs, and you're not going to find this very surprising, they do often say they succeed despite, basically they keep their head below the parapet, not to be noticed by the state. So in the case of Alibaba and Jack Ma, who, story's pretty well known, he said something they didn't like, and he was pretty quiet for a while. So one of his companies, Alipay, which is like a payments fintech company, they were supposed to IPO, which means that they would issue shares to the public. And the people who are running it, so it's like the companies you have here, Stripe or Wise or Revolut, basically. So when they IPO, the people who worked on them do pretty well. In fact, the top people told me they would have been billionaires. But the day before the IPO, or something pretty close to it, the IPO was called off by the government. So this kind of, I think, they're still working there, I think, and hoping for the best, by the way, just for that story. But I think, so, I think it has, talking about sort of China's growth rate and linking it to changes like this, I think that really isn't going to help, is it? Because, in a lot of countries, you absolutely, all countries, you need entrepreneurship. And also you need to have, most of job creation actually comes from SMEs, small, medium-sized enterprises. You need to foster startups. You need to foster, and so if it becomes harder and harder to get to scale because there could be something like that, I think that is going to be extremely challenging. And then just picking up the point about the population, what Kerry mentioned, that's basically a halving of China's population. So it's very challenging to know exactly how technology may or may not work at this point. So you look at Japan, they use a lot of robotics and technology because they have the fastest aging society. It hasn't really helped their productivity rate or job creation. They have less demand for jobs because the population is aging so quickly. So we'd have a lot of examples of aging societies and whether or not technology can actually, with just not enough data. But I will say Italy and Germany are not too far off. They're about 10 years behind Japan. And China's obviously now getting pretty close to Japan. So it's a problem we're going to see, I think, pretty quickly. And there's a lot more to say about technology, but I don't, we talk about this a lot in terms of the environment. Technology is a solution, but it's not the solution. Lots of things require changes in behavior, changes in how you run a company, how you run there's a lot more to it, than that. By the way, so Dan Wong, I did an FT webinar because his book has been shortlisted for the FT. I'm so good at selling other people's books, And he basically, he said the premise of his book is that China is run by engineers, so they build, and then he said America's run by lawyers, they obstruct. But yeah, America's quite entrepreneurial, so
I know, but I think that's why he's wrong, because there has been a shift, hasn't there? I mean, when China was going for its growth strategy from the turn of the century or just before, up until maybe from its beginnings, 1978, it was seeing that engineering the future was the way forward. They had to build a new China, literally build a new China. And it's subsequent to that they started introducing much more soft power discussions. So a lot of the Politburo wider Politburo are not engineers anymore. They do have kind of sociology degrees or whatever it might be. So they are branching out in the same way as, when I went to China 2011, they were just starting to teach properly architecture, and then it went into interiors and stuff like that. So it's a symbol of a country that is developing. That's what happened in this country. So why shouldn't it happen over there? Very quickly, I think Jack Ma actually put his finger on a problem, really, which is why he got clobbered. The idea that the state will be a brake on real, genuine innovation by the private sector, and for that, obviously, he went a bit too far and disappeared for a while. But there is a situation now where the state-owned enterprises, are taking up maybe 35% or whatever it is of most businesses within China. So, and students, young people are wanting to move into them because it's a secure job, as Hugo was saying, run by the state. So I'm interested in that idea about what innovation means in China, because I've always had a worry that, to be innovative, you have to have free critical thinking, engagement with ideas. And within China, you're allowed to have that until it becomes a problem. So do you really have innovation? Can it really go forward? And then I also wanted to get Kerry's views on, what's actually happening within China itself as a political stability situation, because there are purges within the military. There's purges, left, right, and center in some respects. And also there's this recent story about Xi Jinping walking around with a limp and maybe having a heart attack. So I just wondered whether there is a instability inherent at the moment within China that maybe wouldn't have been talked about prior to that.
Yeah, so the purge of the military is 9 figures, one of whom, He Weidong, was the deputy of what's called the Central Military Commission, which is about 12 people. But Xi Jinping, as a civilian, chairs that, and He Weidong was the second. He was in the Politburo, which is 24 people, I think, at the moment. So he had a very unique position. So his removal is consequential. There are also 8 other figures. I don't think, to be honest, that this is a political thing. I know that sounds strange, but I can't see why, as a political thing, you would remove such a big slab of people. I mean, that's really, really significant. I think it is about corruption, because the military has received significant amounts of money. And I think there's probably been huge issues with where that money's gone. So the Rocket Ballistics Force, which is the one that people have looked at, has some kind of involvement in the nuclear arsenal. I mean, they've had billions invested into them. And, kind of when there were sort of maneuvers near Taiwan a couple of years ago when Pelosi visited, they then discovered that half the kit that they tried to sort of just set off as a test didn't actually set off. So the money was wasted. So I think it is a corruption kind of purge, whether Xi Jinping, so I was asked to write Xi Jinping's obituary by The Guardian on Sunday because they'd heard that he had a stroke. And of course, on Monday, he appeared at a foreign meeting looking absolutely fine. So I kind of find these, he's disappeared often over the years. He disappeared in 2012 for a couple of weeks. He disappeared at the beginning of the pandemic for a couple of weeks. He's a bit similar to, I think Stalin Mao Zedong used to disappear from time to time. And, it's hard to interpret these things. What's his health like? Who knows? That's a kind of big secret. But all these people saying that he's, been taken to a villa near Beijing by some party elders. And no, that's just not going to happen. They're not going to have a good life, these people, if they try and sit him down and tell him that he's got to change. He's completely in control.
Mao died eventually, though, didn't he? Anyway, here you go.
Again, I'll go look at a rather lower level of importance than Kerry and think about the kind of attitude changes that have taken place, quite apart from the attitudes to your own survival in society and whether you could have the courage to get married or have a job or whether you can support your family and so on. All these worries are very real, as I think I mentioned a moment ago. But also there's, I think, a kind of loss of faith in the Communist Party, which I never really perceived 10 years ago, certainly. Even those who had been brought up with a visceral hatred of the Communist Party, and I can assure you there are many of them, not only among the middle classes who suffered most in the Cultural Revolution, but also among the peasantry and so on. Not only among them, but among people who had given their faith and their trust to the Communist Party, I think the attitudes are now more complex. Let's put it like that. There are people who have suffered in the housing crisis. They put all their savings into a second flat so that they could let it out and pay their child's school fees. There is the engineering company in Shanghai, which found that the local party decided to put in a party committee over it and virtually destroy it by taking equity from it and so forth. The son of the owner of that engineering company was at Warwick, and he's now gone to the United States and hopes to set up an engineering company in the United States. They're abandoning China insofar as they can, as indeed are several quite large Chinese organizations which are coming over here and doubtless going to many other parts of the world as well. There are the people who ran tutoring companies. Now, it doesn't sound very big. We don't go a great deal on tutoring in here, but there were thousands upon thousands of tutoring companies in China, which government fiat closed down. Independent education has been very hit by the economic downturn. And as I mentioned earlier, the media have suffered tremendously, mainly because of the loss of advertising from companies which can't do it, but also, of course, because of the change in the social media, changes in social media and so on. And when I go to China now, I have a kind of conversation that I could only dream of 10 years ago, which is where people will sit down, people of every age and generation, and will tell you how awful everything is in China. And even in a few cases, will tell you how bad they think Mr. Xi Jinping is, which is quite an amazing and quite a courageous thing to do. I divide these kind of people, these critics, if you like, into two broad categories. And they all tend, of course, to be middle-class people. I don't walk around with peasants very much, unfortunately. Modernizers and traditionalists. So there are the people who really hope that China would become like the West, but even better, and become like the United States, but even better. And they would have the high-tech companies and the universities and all those wonderful things that a really modern country has. And there are the traditionalists who actually think that the Communist Party has destroyed everything that's good in China. But at the same time, both these categories of people are also intensely patriotic, which gives them a lot of problems, because I think they are very proud of the achievements of China since the death of Mao Zedong, which have been very great, but also they are very fearful of what is to come if the government continues with the kind of policies and the kind of repression that is going on. And they fear for the future. This is not opposition, but you will even find people saying, one responsible company leader said to me when I was last in China having dinner with him, he said, "Where do you think the revolution in China will come from? Is it going to be the older people who can't bear the changes, or is it the younger people who want more changes?" And the mere question was to me absolutely astonishing. But similar things like that, similar tales and comments like that are coming out all the time, and not only from people over in the West, but people in China as well.
Very good. Thank you very much. Give a round of applause to a fantastic panel, please.